Welcome to issue 40 of Language Testing Bytes. In today's issue, we're going to talk about the virtual special issue on Voices from the Global South, which is edited by Dr. Salomé Villa Larenas. Salomé has invited two guest speakers to discuss this topic today, Dr. Gladys Quevedo Camargo and Dr. Gerriet Janssen. Salomé, Gladys, and Gerriet, thank you so much for joining me today. And Salomé, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruslan. While preparing for this issue, I discovered a significantly low number of publications from countries from the Global South, including those from Latin America. This prompted me to reach out to published Latin American authors to explore the reasons behind this phenomenon. So I have two guests with me today. Our first guest is Gladys Quevedo Camargo, as you mentioned. She's associate professor and researcher at the Department of Foreign Languages and Translation and vice president of the Institute of Letters and at the University of Brasilia in Brazil. And she is also a co-founder and current vice president of La Alta, the Latin American Association for Language Testing and Assessment. And our second guest is Gerriet Janssen. Gerriet is a researcher, a research scientist at Educational Testing Service, where he conducts research related to language teaching, learning, and the assessment of writing. Gerriet was a professor at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia for 16 years, where his research focused on practical work related to running for language programs, including language assessment, program evaluation, and English for research publication purposes. He is also a founding member and current member at large of La Alta. Gladys and Gerriet, thank you for joining us today. I would like to first talk about you and to get to know you a bit better before we start talking about the virtual issue topic. So can you tell me a little bit about your experience in Brazil and Colombia in the language testing field?
Maybe I could start. So, hello, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I've been working with language testing and assessment for many years, and my main role is as a teacher educator, and my main focus is on language assessment literacy. So I have been taking part in many conferences. I have learned a lot. My PhD is in language studies, but I work a lot with applied linguistics, and my career somehow took me to language testing and assessment, which is an area I really love. I am passionate about it. So I think that's it. I'm a language teacher educator, and I work with language assessment literacy.
Thank you, Gladys. Gary?
Good afternoon, Salo. Thank you for having me here today. Yeah, so when I was in Colombia, I was also, I think similar to Gladys, I was also a teacher first and foremost. And so I worked predominantly with teaching writing and academic writing, but also teaching English for research publication purposes or helping scholars in Colombia publish their academic research. And so that was my first focus, but then I also started doing a PhD while being a teacher in Bogota. And so I really enjoyed the topics of language assessment, and there was a lot of very practical work that I could be doing in our language program that was supporting the program placement exam. And so I got to do that a lot. I think it's also important to note that in Colombia, and especially in Bogota, there's a relatively large number of language assessment projects. These are sponsored and frequently by the Colombian government or the Bogota city. And then they usually are in collaboration with British Council. And so I was able, when I was at Los Andes, I had a colleague, Alexis Lopez, and he was very active as a language assessment researcher, and he really pulled me into the field. And he asked me to collaborate first as an item writer, and I slowly gained more and more experience then as a data analyst of the data we had gathered, and then actually starting to write publications. So he really brought me into the field of language assessment. And that I probably just would have been a teacher and not have gotten into it, except that he really did pull me into it.
So you both have plenty of experience in the language testing field in your context. So I would like to know first if you have published your work in any local journals in Brazil and Colombia or international journals.
So I've done both. I've published in a local journal called Colombian Applied Linguistics Journal. For me, as I was gaining experience as a young PhD student, it was really exciting to realize that I could be publishing the PhD research that I was doing in my coursework, and that it would actually have a relevant local audience. And this was actually important because all of the data that I was analyzing during my PhD studies was from Universidad de los Andes, from that language program placement test. And so it was very relevant to the Colombian context. And then later, I guess as I gained more experience and as I gained colleagues who were also really incredible co-author group, we started realizing that we had the technical skills to actually be able to, first identify the gaps that were kind of important or relevant in the language assessing field, and then be able to answer them with analyses that were probably of interest to the readership. And so I think that's kind of my trajectory is, as I gained expertise as a professional, I went from publishing in the more local journals and very small and kind of adorable, descriptive statistic analyses. And that was really a big deal. And talking about it was really a big deal at first. And it actually meant something to our language program. And then, getting into the more sophisticated stuff later.
Same goes for me. I have also published in national and international journals, but not many in international journals. Most of my articles are published in Brazilian journals, and I have a few published in international journals. I also have both chapters in English, but normally when I publish in English, it's because I had an invitation to do so. And I can explain why. For us Brazilians, we have a journal ranking system, and it's very important that we researchers here in Brazil publish in the high tiers of this ranking system, and because that gives us points when we have, for example, career development, or we are going to request a grant or something like that. So it's important that we have publications in high-tier Brazilian journals. I have another reason to publish mostly in Portuguese. Because I worry a lot with language assessment literacy, I think publishing in Portuguese is a way of promoting language assessment literacy in Brazil. If I only publish in English, that might not help my teachers, that might not help my audience in the country, that sometimes does not have enough language, enough English knowledge to read a text on language assessment and language testing in English. So I have these two reasons to publish in Portuguese mostly. Not many international journals are listed in our ranking system. The name of our ranking system is Qualis.
If I could add to that, I just want to really highlight how important local publication can be, exactly what Gladys was just saying. At Los Andes, there was actually quite a big debate about, these international journals, they get literally you get a lot of points for promotion when you publish in the first quartile international journals. And you get many fewer points if you're publishing in a local journal. But exactly what Gladys was saying is so crucial, which is to say that the effect of our publications and the effect of our work is possibly bigger when we're publishing in the local journals. So my publication in Colombia might actually have more impact because it would be read by teachers who were then getting this language assessment skills. So I think there is a really interesting tension. Thank you, Gladys, for pointing that out.
Yeah, right.
There's such a tension about maybe it's more relevant, even though it's possibly more basic and less technically complex, but it may actually be more important and bring about bigger changes.
Yeah, I agree. And if I could add something else, if this international journal is not listed, even if it's the best of the best journal in the world, it doesn't mean anything for us in terms of job promotion. And there is another thing, we are demanded to publish with our students. our MA students, our PhD students, and also our undergrad students. And then when you have a publication with students that are undergrads or MA, it's very unusual to be able to publish or to manage to publish in an international journal.
The things that you mentioned about the impact of research and publications, I think is really fascinating in my opinion, because in the context of let's say an international journal, when we talk about the impact and, generalizability of the findings, we think of the global impact of that research, on the field in general, which is important. But I don't think we ever really talk about the local impact, the impact of that research on the local context, local community. And that's, I think, is probably as important, if not more important, than the global impact.
Going on with this, with this topic, sometimes generalizability is not the most important thing for us, for example, in Brazil, because we work a lot with action research and context-based research, especially in language assessment, classroom assessment. So not all the results are generalizable, right? But they serve as a tool or a means of reflection. And then they make teachers and researchers think of different contexts and how things happen in different places with different audiences or, students.
Thank you. So have you published in the language testing journal? Gladys, maybe you can.
I haven't. No, I have never. And I have never tried. But I have friends who have.
Have you thought about it?
I have. Of course I have, because I usually read the articles. I have never felt that my research would be the kind of research that I carry out would be accepted. This is not only my idea, but also some friends of mine, because of the type of research we do. The studies that we see published in the language testing journal, they have a strong emphasis on quantitative methodologies, for example, and our focus is mostly qualitative and mixed, but not so quantitative. So for us to be able to publish, we would have to change the way we carry out research completely. My projects, they do not produce so much statistics. And that's what normally language testing journal shows.
And your article may need to be written in English instead of in Portuguese, right?
Yes. Well, actually, there is one particular project that will have to be bilingual, because it is being carried out with the sponsorship of an international agency. So, of course, I'll have to produce something in English, but I also have to produce something in Portuguese, because then the local readers could have access to it.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you had asked your colleagues if they have published in a language testing journal as well. Are there any other reasons that they mentioned why they haven't done it?
Yeah, well, the non-inclusion in our ranking system, like the qualis that I mentioned. Also, one of my colleagues mentioned that the process of submission is very bureaucratic and a bit off-putting. So it's not very motivating for the researchers. It takes a lot of time.
Gerriet, you have published in the language testing journal.
Yeah, I think I was really able to kind of hit this very sweet spot with language testing in the articles I've been able to publish. What I mean by that is both of the articles that I've written for language testing were locally relevant concepts. So the first article was talking about whether there is difference in the scoring if we allow raters to do tertium quid. So if there's a discrepancy between the two raters, what should we do? And so in the Latin American context in Colombia, there's oftentimes no third rater. So we have this very, very practical concern of, is just negotiating the score verbally and then putting a final score that you just agree on, is that affecting the scoring inference of the validation argument? Again, it's the sweet spot because it took this local concern that's really a practical issue in language programs where there may not be just extra raters hanging around ready to provide a third score. But we were also, as I said, I had this incredible group of colleagues, John Trace and Valerie Meyer, in my PhD program. And so we were taking multivariate statistics at the time, so we could apply profile analysis and rationalisis to how we went about modeling whether or not this is affecting the scoring inference of the validation argument. And then the second project was it was another local concern, and the special issue editor April Ginther reached out to me because I was literally sitting next to her at lunch, and she reached out to me and touched my elbow and said, we have this special issue coming up on publishing language test development in local contexts. Are you interested? Or do you know of anything that's going on in Latin America? And I said, well, actually, I've been working on one myself. And so that was a really nice way that I could publish. I think the article, you could say, is a bit of a compendium of, 4 or 5 smaller projects, all of which were building language assessment literacy of local professors as we were doing a placement test retrofit. So retrofitting the test, professional development experiences, and the article kind of captured a taste of all of those. I think it's quite a different article than the typical IMRD, so introduction, methods, results, discussion. It was a little bit different because it was a language assessment literacy project. Those were the 2 publications I've had with language testing. For me, they were both exciting and they were both important because they were really answering real world questions. They weren't just a theoretical exploration. They really had important value in the local language program that I was working in.
So in the context of Brazil, I did a literature review, a search of Latin American publications in the journal, and I found one test review from Brazil, from the CELPE-BRAS test in the language testing journal. So I was wondering, what other reasons do you think are related to Brazilian researchers not publishing in journals such as language testing?
Well, apart from the reasons I gave you, we could also talk about the non-relevance of local issues to a journal like the Language Testing Journal, the different methodologies that we use, and probably the different concerns we have. I think our tradition in terms of applied linguistics is different. We are very much focused on the classroom, not so much on exams. We don't have many researchers that focus on language testing and assessment, although we do have some. Now, just as an example, if you look at the CELPE-BRAS production, for example, there is a repository in a university here in the south of Brazil that has lots of publications, lots of MA dissertations, PhD. So I think to what extent is a Brazilian exam relevant for the rest of the world? And there is another reason I think not many people here from my friends mentioned, but I'd like to mention that in terms of the English language itself. So the academic writing in Brazil is slightly different from the standard academic writing in the Anglo-Saxon world. So this is another issue. We have to adapt to the way international journals want us to write. Sometimes it's a wonderful researcher, but his academic English is not that perfect, just like an international journal would expect. So there are cultural issues involved as well.
So in the case of Colombia, I found your articles, Gerriet, and I found only one article on washback by Colombian researcher Cuñoz and Alvarez, 2010, about washback of an oral assessment system in the EFL classroom. And that's the only other article from Colombia I found. So the same question to you. Why do you think language testing Colombian researchers don't publish in the language testing journal?
So I think for me, the answer is really related to research networks. And so you mentioned Ana Muñoz, and that's really funny to me because she's a friend of mine. And she was also connected to the work that Alexis Lopez was doing. And so Alexis Lopez really was creating this really strong research network in Colombia. And this originated, as I was telling you, in this government project that was in collaboration with British Council. And that project was creating a national level English test. And so that's where I met Anna, and that's where I really got to work with Alexis for the first time. And so I think if you look at the literature, I think so MJ Curry and Teresa Lillis are an author team, and they talk about research networks and they talk about academic publication. And they basically, their whole premise is if you live in a peripheral context, such as the Global South, you are probably not as closely networked as people who live in these more central countries, such as North America or Europe. And I can attest to that experience. When I was during my PhD program, I was, tightly networked with colleagues. As I said, we were incredibly productive. It was really exciting that we could produce so much stuff and that we had this constant contact with each other. After I finished my PhD program and I returned to Columbia, factor two is that people get really, really busy, I think, in the Global South. I think in North America, at least, which is the other context I'm really familiar with, in a professorship, you would probably only have 2 classes per semester. That's not the case in Colombia. You're teaching 3, look at Gladys. It's also not the case in Brazil. And so when you're teaching 2 classes, it might be 12 hours of contact hours instead of what you would have in the United States, which might be something like, I don't know, 6 hours per week. There can be a lot of institutional projects that aren't necessarily publishable, but that you need to be doing that kind of work. I guess an example for me was that I wrote a lot of different courses, and so I taught a lot of different classes, and I think that this consumed a lot of my own time. I think also being in Colombia, even though I feel like I have strong relationships with people in North America and Europe, but I still felt the one thing is to be good friends, and another thing is to have common research interests. And so I think that is part of the difficulty. That, of course, it's great to see all these people at the international conferences and everything, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily ready to support you in a research project. Because as you just were saying, or what Gladys was saying, doing research takes so much time. And there's a real level of trust and a real level of commitment that's needed. And maybe that's not going to happen. I think that that's a really big difficulty, is this is something complex to cultivate in this research network. How do you trust somebody that really all of your effort you're going to do is going to result in something? And that's a challenge. And when you have very limited time, suddenly you can see that what loses is the research publication. If you're not networked with people from these central countries, it can be very, very difficult to publish.
Before 2017, Latin American language testers didn't know each other.
I was
unless they were connected through for an university. Let's say we both studied in California, we both studied in Lancaster. Since we started LALTA, since LTRC 2017, where all the Latin Americans got together in that little room saying, oh my God, we're so many of us and we have all the same interests. Something happened that I think that we can share the same concerns and actually start sharing the same research interests and finding peers that we didn't have before and support each other. And it's not a fast thing to do because it's we are super busy. As you mentioned, we have so many classes a semester, but we're still that network gives you some terrain to work and to plant some seed and to move forward from there.
It's been so exciting to work with both Salomé and Gladys on LALTA for the last 7 years. As you said, Salo, we are all working together on bringing about the different LALTA conferences that we have. And so to me, one of the most important outcomes of the conference is the conference series, I should say, is that we are creating, we were missing a research network, and we're doing the work to create the research network.
Yeah, I agree. I think when we started Lauta, that made a lot of difference. That was the beginning of a dream. That was having this community of practice. It's almost a community of practice that we have. And for me personally, this is very important. That's why we keep going. It's voluntary work, but we keep going because we need that. And this has helped me create a network in Brazil as well. Nowadays, I have a study and research group, and I have more than 40 people that are willing to meet every 15 days to discuss an article, to talk about assessment, people from different languages. Portuguese is a foreign language, Spanish is a foreign language, and English is a foreign language, and even Portuguese is a mother tongue. So we have to have spaces to talk about assessment, but that's a local issue. And we use articles that are written in abroad to localize, to bring the discussions that people are discussing somewhere to connect to our problems, try to find solutions to our problems. So this network is very important.
I would just add to that as well. And our network also has, or our community of practice, as you rightly call us, we have really specific concerns. We're interested in a lot of issues related to language assessment literacy, which means for me, the practical issues in your classroom of how can you make sure that you're assessing in a way that's responsible and embodies good assessment practices. And so this is a real need. And so it's exciting because I think I think LALSA has been able to help us find each other and provide a space to be able to talk about those different questions together. So yeah, it's been a really exciting community of practice that has got going.
I also checked how many times LTRC had been held in Global South country. It has only happened in 3 times. Mexico, I think 2010, if I'm not mistaken. Hammamet in 2021, and then Bogota in 2017. Out of, I don't know how many LTRCs, probably 30.
No more.
So that is something to think about.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened in Hammamet after LTRC was held. Probably it was a little bit different because it was online. So there was no this chance of networking or creating such an impact locally. But when it happened in Latin America, it was a huge hurricane. Like people got together and started, going out for drinks and talking about projects and stuff like that. And I'm pretty sure that happened in Mexico 10 years ago because now language testing in Mexico is pretty strong. You have the Veracruz test, and then you have another project, and there was a big project by the British Council some years ago in Cambridge. So something happened there that made the language testing field like stronger in that country. So those little seeds actually started growing somehow.
So what do you think can be done to encourage and help researchers from South America to publish their research in international journals like language testing? And do you think such encouragement and help are actually needed, given what we've heard today?
Well, I would say it is needed. And some possibilities would be maybe having a Latin America special issue. Maybe think about the possibility of valuing production of other countries, productions in other languages, for example, about exams in other languages, not only about TOEFL, IELTS, and things like that, but other exams that are being produced in different countries. So being open to that would be interesting. Also, in terms of the proposal of the text, of the manuscripts and the proposal of the research, consider that there are cultural differences, that not everyone writes within the standards of Anglo-Saxon writing. There was something a friend of mine mentioned that I thought was interesting. It was, well, nowadays people talk so much about English as a lingua franca. So in international journals in general, this is not mentioned. So we still need to follow the standards of correct English. So maybe this is something to think about. Another suggestion that was given by a friend of mine was to think about the possibility of changing the marketing focus a little bit. For example, not only on testing researchers, but also focusing on teachers and PhD students, which might have a section to publish their work or being open to different genres, not only the classic scientific article, like reports or something like that. Being more open to qualitative research, which is also possible within the rigors of scientific work, ethical work, but qualitative research is also possible. So I think these are our suggestions here, not only mine, but also from my 8 friends.
I was thinking that definitely the short reports or the brief reports genre, I think I would include language in as you frame that, or even just have very clear publicity moments where you overtly recruit these short reports or the brief reports from these different regions. And in fact, maybe it would be, a consideration would be to call, instead of a brief report, it could be brief and regional reports. And so something that is clearly stated to be coming from different world regions. I think as a person is gaining experience joining a research network, the short reports are a really good way to gain practice with publication, with what Gladys was talking about, like what are the publication standards, what does the process feel like? All of that can be really, really, I think, even frightening somehow if you're not familiar with it, and you get the reviewers' comments back and you don't know what to do. So it's a great place to start with these shorter texts so that people can gain confidence. And then maybe as a last idea, I would just say, I believe that some other journals, if they see that there's an article that has promise, that's from a less represented region, they will really, really get an article reviewer who is able to provide the critical feedback that can help shape it into an article that is that's going to be at the journal's level of the standard. And so I think that that's important, that, if there are reviewers, or to have a small cadre of reviewers who are really able and willing to have kind of this attitude of not just shooting the article down, but rather, hey, let's really work together and build this because the seed of your idea is really good, The thing that I didn't mention about my colleagues is I really was thinking, we're in this really big language program. There's so much data being collected about really very real world concerns. And this is interesting to other people. But because people think that a publication has to be an encyclopedia, few people publish on it because they think that the scope of a publication is so big.
Gladys and Gerriet, you both brought up so many interesting issues today that made me take a bit of a different look at what we do at international journals in terms of the perspective that we take on the submissions. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and ideas. And Salomé, thank you so much for organizing this conversation.
Thank you for the space as well.
I just want to thank you very much for listening to us. This is important. But Thank you very much for the opportunity. Yes.
Yeah.
And I feel really privileged to be able to work with these guys and know many other people in Latin America and be able to connect with international researchers. I feel privileged. And that's why my sense of responsibility with my Brazilian community is so strong. Because not many people have the opportunities I have been having when I go to conferences, to LTRC or to other conferences and see big names talking, and it's amazing. So I feel really privileged, and I value this very much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. Thanks, Salomé. It's really wonderful to be here today.
So thank you very much for taking time to participate in this interview, and I look forward to welcoming you all in the next issue of Language Testing Bytes.